Good morning, beautiful children. And we are back for another fabulous day of learning. And we are going to read the next chapter in Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. Today, the chapter is called The Marketplace. Let's do a quick review of what we've been learning so far in this story. Mrs. Frisbee has enlisted the help of Nicodemus and the other rats. She's explained her problem. With her house and how she needs help moving it. They have graciously agreed, and they know Jonathan Frisbee. They were good friends. So there's some interesting things that I think we're going to be learning as we go along. So today, this is called, what the most important thing we learned yesterday, sorry guys, is that Jonathan Frisbee was killed by Dragon the cat when he was trying to put some drugs in Dragon's food. And the rats knew about it and knew about his death, but didn't say anything to Mrs. Frisbee. Now, we also learned that they drug Dragon sometimes when the rats are trying to do work so that Dragon will not attack them and will leave them alone. So we learned some really important things yesterday. Let's find out more today. Today's chapter, The Marketplace. Mrs. Frisbee's head was buried in her arms. "I never knew," she said. "All I knew was that he didn't come back. I never knew what happened. I didn't even know that he knew you. Why didn't he ever tell me?" Justin touched Mrs. Frisbee on the shoulder gently. "It's hard for you to learn this way so suddenly," he said. "We really thought about telling you when it happened, but then we decided that we shouldn't because it wouldn't have done any good anyway." "You ask why Jonathan never told you about us?" Nicodemus added. "He had a reason, a really good reason. Still, he worried a lot about it, and he might have told you in the end. But then it was too late." "What was the reason?" Mrs. Frisbee raised her face. There were tears on her cheeks, but she'd stopped crying. "To answer that, I would have to tell you quite a long story. The whole story about us, and Nim, and Jonathan, and how we all came to be here. He came with us, you see. I don't mind that, but I know if there is not time now to tell you." "I think there's time," said Justin. "If Mr. Aegis and I go to get the powder while you are retelling the story." "With this leg," said Mr. Aegis glumly, "that will take long enough for you to tell the story 2 times." "I had forgotten," said Justin. "Would it be better if I just left you here alone?" "No," said Mr. Aegis. "There are so many different powders in my storeroom. Why, you wouldn't know which one to bring back. I'll go with you, but we'll go slowly." "And I?" said Arthur. "Let me see. We will need equipment for tonight. We will need shovels, crowbars, blocks, tackle, rollers." He left the room, still making a list of tools for the night. Nicodemus said to Mrs. Frisbee, "I think that we too should leave the library. There will be others coming in, like Isabella, to practice reading, and some to do research." "Research?" said Mrs. Frisbee. "Oh, we've got some new books on agriculture, farming, gardening, fertilizing, things like that, and we're studying them. It's part of the plan, you know." "I don't know what the plan is." "No," agreed Nicodemus, I know you don't, but when I've told you our story, well, then you are going to understand the plan too." He opened up the door and he led Mrs. Frisbee down the hallway, past several more doors. All of them were closed. He stopped before one, which he opened. "My office," he said. "Please come in." The room she entered was smaller than the library, but much larger, much more comfortable. The room she entered was smaller than the library, but much more comfortably furnished, almost elegant. There was a rug on the floor, the same pattern that she noticed in the hallway, a light in the ceiling, and another in the wall next to the table. There was a bookshelf, and on the shelf was an electric clock, humming quietly to itself. A book lay open on the table, with a chair in front of it. Against the opposite wall stood a small sofa, neatly upholstered in cloth. But what attracted Mrs. Frisbee's attention most was a box in one corner of the room. It stood with dials. and a small light was shining in front of it, and from the box came the most soft music. She listened, very entranced. "Oh, you like music," said Nicodemus. "So do I." "Oh my, that must be a radio." Again, something vaguely reminded Mrs. Frisbee, something that Jonathan had once told her. Music. She had heard it only 2 or 3 times in her life, when the Fitzgibbons had left a window open and someone was playing inside, and never close up. But it was lovely music. "Yes," said Nicodemus. "We didn't get it for the music, of course, but we brought it here to hear the news. Still, as long as it's here, why not use it for music too?" He sat down, and so did Mrs. Frisbee. "Now," he said, "I will tell you about NIM. You'll be most interested, I think, because your husband was part of it. And when I've finished, I think you will see why he felt that he could not tell you himself." "The story begins," Nicodemus continued, "not at Nim, but at a marketplace on the edge of a very big city. It was called the Farmers' Market, a great square of a place with a roof over part of it and no walls to speak of. There early every morning the farmers arrived from all over the surrounding countryside with trucks full of tomatoes, corn, cabbage, potatoes, eggs, chickens, hams, food for the city. One part of it was reserved for the fishermen who brought crabs and oysters and bass and flounders. It was a fine place, noisy and full of smells. We lived near this market. My father, my mother, and my 9 sisters and brothers and I lived underground in a big pipe that had once been part of a storm sewer, but it was no longer used. There were hundreds of other rats in the neighborhood. It was a rather rough life, but not so hard as you might think because of the market. Every evening at 5 o'clock, the farmers and the fishermen would close up their stalls, pack up their trucks, and go home. At night, hours later, the clean-up men would arrive with brooms and hoses. But in between, the market was ours. The food the farmers left behind, peas and beans that fell from the trucks, tomatoes and squashes, pieces of meat and fish trimmed as waste. They lay on the sidewalks and in the gutters. They filled great cans that were supposed to be covered, but they seldom were. There was always 10 times more than we could eat, and so there was never any need to fight over the food. Fighting? Quite the contrary. The marketplace was a perfect place for playing, and so we did, the young rats at least. As soon as we had finished eating, there were empty boxes for hide and seek. There were walls to climb, tin cans to roll, and pieces of twine to tie and swing on. There was even in the middle of the square a fountain to swim in when the weather was hot. Then, at the first clang of the clean-up men in the distance, one of the older rats would sound the alarm, and everyone would pick up as much food as they possibly could carry and run home. All of us kept nice reserves of food at home because there were some days, Sundays and holidays, that the market would be closed, and we were never quite sure when that would happen. When I went to the market, it was usually with 2 companions, my older brother Gerald and a friend of ours named Jenner. These were my 2 closest friends. We liked the same games, we liked the same jokes, the same topics of conversation, even the same kinds of food. I particularly admired my friend Jenner, who was extremely quick and very smart. One evening in early fall, Jenner and I set out for the market. It must have been September, for the leaves were just turning yellow and some children were throwing football in a vacant lot. Gerald had to stay home that night. He'd caught a bad cold, and since the air was chilly, my mother thought he should not go out. So Jenner and I went out without him. I remember we promised to bring him back some of his favorite food, corned beef and cabbage, if we could find any. We took to our usual route to the market, not along the streets, but through the narrow walkways between the buildings, mostly commercial warehouses and garages, that bordered the square. And as we walked, we were joined by more rats. At that time of day, they converged on the marketplace from all directions, and when we reached the square, I noticed that there was a white truck of an old there I noticed that there was a white truck of an odd square shape parked on the street bordering it, perhaps a block away. I say I noticed it. I did not pay any attention to it, for trucks were common enough in that part of town, but if I had, I would have noticed that printed on each side of it were four small letters: NIMH. NIM. I would not have known what they were for, of course, for at that time I neither I nor any of the other rats knew how to read. It was growing dark when we reached the market, but through the dusk we could see that there was an unusually large supply of food, a great mound of it, near the center of the square, and away from the roofed portion. I suppose that should have served as a warning to us, but it didn't. I remember Jenner saying, "Oh, they must have had a really busy day," and we ran joyfully toward the pile along with several dozen other rats. And just as we reached the food, it happened. All around us, suddenly, there was shouting. Bright, blinding searchlights flashed on, aimed at us and at the mound of food, so that when we tried to run away from it, we could not. We could not see where we were going because the lights were blinding us. Between and behind the lights there were shadows moving swiftly, and as they came toward us, I could see that they were men in white uniforms carrying nets, round nets with long handles. "Look out!" cried Jenner. "They're trying to catch us." He darted in one direction and I in another, and then I lost sight of him. We all ran straight towards the men with the nets. There was no other way to run. They had us all encircled. The nets flailed down, scooped up, flailed again. I suppose some rats made it through, slipping between the men and past the lights. I felt a swish. A net just missed me. I turned and I ran back toward the mound, thinking that I might hide myself in it. But then came another swish, and that time I felt the enveloping fibers fall all over me. They entangled my legs, then my neck. I was lifted from the ground along there with three other rats, and the net closed all around us. And that, my dear children, is the end of that. Tomorrow we will read In the Cage. Now we know a little bit more. We know that it seems like the rats were captured by some men in white coats with nets. I wonder what the men in white coats with nets want to do with these rats. So you have two things to tell me about. Can you write and tell me what you think those men in white coats want with all these rats? And now that we know a little bit more about Nicodemus, can you tell me what kind of a character you think he is? Think about the things he's said and the things he's done to help me understand what kind of a character he is. And then tomorrow, we will read some more. Have a fabulous day.